is a PhD candidate at the Erasmus University at Rotterdam. His research project concerns exploring situated and embodied accounts of moral agency and habit. So, Thijs, the floor is yours. You can start.
Yeah, thank you, Evina, for that introduction, and also thanking for hosting me at this wonderful conference. So to start with a confession, I am not an historian, and Jane Addams as such is not the main topic of my research, although I do use her for my research. But I concern myself, as I just said, with examining situated moral agency. So as I'm not an historian, my name is not just to introduce her to her thought, but also to hopefully convince you that as a thinker, she's still very much relevant today, especially on her work in empathy and democracy. So Laura Jane Addams was born in 1816 in Illinois, and died in 1935 in Chicago. She has a resume that can leave a person to be nothing but very impressed. This only becomes even more remarkable when one considers that Addams lived in a time when women had very few opportunities for social leadership and intellectual work. Throughout her lifetime, she was involved in, amongst many other things, the establishment of child labor laws, the women's suffrage movement, the founding of the American Civil Liberties Union, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She was also a strong advocate for many measures that were part of the New Deal politics and dedicated to helping poor immigrants, and many more things I unfortunately do not have time to address. These efforts in helping immigrants bring about women's suffrage and her commitment to world peace, especially given the recent invasion of Ukraine, I'm a little bit sad I'm not talking about her book Newer Ideals of Peace in this talk, but that led her to receive the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. During her lifetime, she was one of the most famous social leaders. Besides her social activism, or better said, because of her social activism, she was in close contact with many great academics, for instance, philosophers such as William James, John Dewey, and Herbert Mead, and sociologists of the early Chicago School of Sociology, such as C.R. Henderson and G.E. Vincent, and of course Mead again, because he was much a sociologist as a philosopher. If she is remembered today, she is mostly remembered for activism and social welfare work. Even in her time, she was mostly referred to as a saintly woman, dedicated to helping the poor, but not so much, with exceptions to her pacifist ideas, as the radical and innovative thinker that she was. For a long time, her theoretical contributions to philosophy and sociology haven't received much recognition. She was either seen as merely applying the ideas of others, such as Dewey, in practice, or denied that she is part of the discipline, such as the work to be considered in the field of social work and not in sociology. Fortunately, in recent decades, this has begun to change, as nowadays Addams gets more recognition as an original thinker, and someone who has made an important contributions to public administration, sociology, and philosophy. In this talk, I discuss one of her core ideas, namely that of sympathetic knowledge, and how it relates to empathy and democracy. Although she doesn't use these terms so much herself, sympathetic knowledge is the idea that we can come to understand others' experiences by engaging in dialogical listening, through which relationships are established that are based on sympathetic or affectionate interpretation. In this talk, I therefore focus on Addams as a philosopher, despite her multidisciplinary background, and will mainly draw upon her book Democracy and Social Ethics, which appeared in 1903. And Addams based her book on multiple lectures that she made earlier in her life. Democracy and Social Ethics is widely considered to be her most systematic and philosophical work, although it differs much from standard philosophical works, as in it mainly talks of the experience of people instead of systematically trying to unfold a theory. Pragmatism is a philosophical tradition that takes practical consequences as central to inquiry. Theory must come from experience and must ultimately return to experience. Knowledge is therefore never an absolute truth, as knowledge can always be falsified in practice. Pragmatists therefore stress the importance of context and process. For pragmatists, knowledge follows from inquiry, that is the testing of our beliefs and experience. In doing so, pragmatists do not subscribe to a strict dualism between theory and practice or action and thought. When classical pragmatists talk about experience, they do not just mean a cognitive state or a sense perception, that is a private internal experience. Our subjective perspective is but a part of experience. Experiences are the interactions we, as organisms, have with our environment. Knowledge is instrumental in organizing our experience. Addams is undeniably a pragmatist thinker for this denial of a strict separation between theory and practice, the centrality of experience in the writing, and a use of the pragmatist notion of inquiry. To understand Addams as a thinker, we must address Hull House, which she is most associated with. Addams found Hull House together with Ellen Gatestar in 1889. You can see her on the most right picture. Hull House was a so-called settlement house based on Toynbee House in London's East End. Settlement houses, and especially Toynbee House, where Christian men aimed to help the poor by living or settling in a house amongst them. Settlement houses were a form of charity, providing neighborhood social services and reform. Settlement houses were not so much there to help individuals, but to identify and eliminate shared problems in the neighborhoods. A settlement house is both a community center as a residence for middle-class volunteers. Addams and Ellen Gatestar would build on and, in time, radically change the practice of a settlement house. In contrast to Toynbee House, Hull House became more egalitarian, more female-dominated, and less religious. Under their leadership, Hull House provided social, educational, and artistic programs for working-class and immigrant populations on Chicago's Near West Side area. Hull House did not operate on a fully formed theory, nor was Hull House a place to test out hypotheses. The activities and activisms arose from the experiences of people from the neighborhood. It expanded eventually into multiple buildings, even containing, amongst others, a kindergarten, gymnasium, and coffee house. According to Addams, its mission was to provide for a higher civic and social life, to institute and maintain educational and philanthropic enterprises, and to investigate and improve the conditions in the industrial districts of Chicago. Hull House was almost solely inhabited by women and run in a radical democratic way. Many of them were innovators in various scientific disciplines. Thus, besides a place of activism and community, Hull House was also an experimental research center into the various problems that plagued the working people and poor immigrants of Chicago. Addams vehemently rejected the term social laboratory. This was no place to test out preconceived theories or abstractions. Hull House served to establish the needs of its neighbors and then act to ameliorate those needs. It was a recognition that insight into social problems and an understanding in how to address those could not be gained unless one was part of the community and in a direct dialogue with experiences of its inhabitants. Instead of studying the workers and immigrants, the women of Hull House work with them. Addams illustrates this in the following quote. I never address a Chicago audience on the subject of the settlement and its vicinity without inviting a neighbor to go with me, that I might curb my hasty generalization by the consciousness that I had an auditor who knew the conditions more intimately than I could hope to do. Hull House in Chicago developed a pragmatist, experimental model of transaction that criticized top-down approaches to problem solving in favor of working with others in a way that calculated to change the attitudes and habits of both the settlement worker, mostly middle and upper class women, and members of the impoverished working class neighborhood with whom they worked. This very brief overview of her work in Hull House is not just meant to sketch a backdrop for her work. Hull House must be understood as a continuous exercise in sympathetic understanding in itself. Hull House is therefore not simply a locale where she did her work, but Hull House as an organization, and more importantly as a community, is a vital part of her philosophical theorizing. Now, Addams in in democracy and social ethics makes an interesting social psychological observation about sympathy. Namely, given the right conditions, a sympathetic reaction is unavoidable. For Addams, sympathy is instinctual. We have a natural tendency to feel sympathy for those who are not as well off as ourselves. To quote her, the evolutionists tell us that the instinct to pity, the impulse to aid his fellows, serve man at a very early period, as a root rule of right and wrong. Addams acknowledges that not everyone shows empathy for or act on the suffering of those that are not as well off. Addams argues that there is no single cause for the failure to experience empathy. This can be because of beliefs an individual has or just a lack of sensitivity, and can remain a perplexing question. I quote again. Just when our affection becomes large enough to care for the unworthy among the poor, as we would care for the unworthy among our own kin, is certainly a perplexing question. However, Addams states that a sympathetic reaction is the result of coming into contact with the many diverse experiences of others. In the opening chapter of Democracy and Social Ethics, Addams writes, and I quote, "To follow the path of social morality results perforce in temper, if not the practice of democratic spirit. For it implies that diversified human experience and resultant sympathy which are the foundation and guarantee of democracy." In this quote, Addams explicitly relates the encounter of experience with a resultant sympathy. Furthermore, Addams also expresses a direct relation between individual experiences and wider social concerns and social change. Our contact with others can leave us perplexed and baffled. The experience of shock, strangers, beliefs and practices are fruitful instigators of inquiry because they challenge our assumptions. In these perplexing situations, we are not sure how to respond to these situations adequately. Your habits, usually understandings and responses cannot change or transform this troubling situation. A perplexed person can choose to hold on to one's assumptions and therefore not get out of the situation and also not grow from the experience, or can undergo a potentially painful process of questioning one's assumptions and values. Only the latter can resolve the problematic, perplexing situation proper and will lead to a resultant sympathy. And finally, the implication here is that sympathy is not just an internal emotion of concern to others, but the sympathy that Addams speaks of is an emotion and understanding that moves us to action. And finally, there is a direct link between democracy and sympathy, to which I will return later. So besides these descriptions of the psychology and operations of sympathy, Addams makes a normative claim. And I quote, "We have learned as common knowledge that much of the insensibility and hardness of the world is due to the lack of imagination which prevents the realization of the experiences of other people. Already there is a conviction that we are under a moral obligation in choosing our experiences, since the result of those experiences must ultimately determine our understanding of life. We know instinctively that if we grow contemptuous of our fellow, our conscious limit our intercourse to certain kinds of people whom we had previously decided to respect. We not only tremendously circumscribe our range of life, but limit the scope of our ethics." The first interesting position that Addams takes in this quote is that we have an instinctual moral obligation to help others. Thus, Addams emphasizes our relationality towards each other as a departing point for ethics. We are not atomistic individuals as liberal theories understand us, but we are social creatures, deeply dependent upon and fundamentally intertwined with each other. The second interesting position that Addams takes in this quote is that for her we are under a moral obligation to choose our experiences. But why is it important that we are careful in choosing our experiences? Addams draws this conclusion from the centrality of experience to understanding in pragmatism. Namely, knowledge comes from the inquiry of our experiences and must ultimately be tested in experience. Thus, we come to a further observation on sympathy. Namely, that sympathy also has an epistemic function, or in other words, sympathetic understanding has both an ethical and epistemic function. Addams describes a process that's both rational and emotional. It is through experiences that a person grows, both in capability, knowledge, and morals, and through the experience of others that we can especially grow. We can confront our prejudices and false beliefs. As one walks with others, one confronts perplexities, realizes the measure of one's own prejudices, and moves towards sympathetic understanding with one's fellow travelers, as Addams would put it. Through this process, one's intellectual, moral, and emotional sensibilities or habits are reshaped. Fisher formulates Addams' position as follows. Mere knowledge of people's needs, ideals of humanity's unity, and the desire to be benevolent are not powerful enough to motivate actions. But when sympathetic instincts are activated in the presence of human needs, then knowledge and the will become able to direct these instincts into helpful activity. Thus, in order to be motivated to help others, mere knowledge of another one's situation is not enough. Associating with people who largely share your own experiences and therefore beliefs and perspectives do not allow us to grow much. That is, to gain new insights and test our beliefs. Thus, if we want to grow morally and as a person, we must seek out the experiences of others. In particular, in order to become better ourselves, we must gain intimate knowledge of those experiences of others. There is a moral and epistemic necessity to finding diverse social experiences. Although Addams, to my knowledge, does not use the term empathy itself, it does seem to be the best term for describing what Addams has in mind. Empathy is a problematic notion in that it's surrounded by a significant amount of conceptual confusion and has different meanings. In psychology, empathy is generally seen as either an emotional contagion or a mental program that gives us feelings that are congruent with those of another. Within the context of politics and morality, empathy is often seen as problematic. For instance, Paul Bloom argues that empathy leads us to favor unjustly those that are not near to us to the detriment those that are near to us to the detriment of those that are not. Or Jesse Prince argues that empathy can lead to group thinking and intolerance. Empathy is problematic because it makes us biased. Empathy is taken to class with the universal or intersubjective aspirations of our moral values and principles, as it is only focused on the here and now. So if we bring Addams' work into this contemporary context, where description of empathetic processes seems inappropriate for social ethics and attributing an epistemic role to it. However, Addams makes an innovative move, where often even proponents of a central role for empathy and morality understand empathy to be a mere intuitive automatic response, just like the opponents of empathy. Addams is more concerned with how empathy is employed. Although empathy and sympathy are instinctual also for Addams, the effects of them are dependent on how those instincts are employed in action. In discussing how empathy should be employed, Addams also offers a solution to the worries of our contemporary empathy skeptics. Empathy should be employed as an inquiry, a problem-solving of situations that perplex us. This problem-solving necessarily involves seeking out diverse experiences in an empathetic manner. Empathy is an active seeking out of another's experience in the form of an imaginative act. Biases can be avoided or mitigated by engaging with others in an experimental empathetic inquiry. We therefore have an obligation to seek out those that do not share our perspectives. Thus, Addams also gives empathy a central role in our moral inquiries. Thus, as I already said, for Addams, moral inquiry begins with a situation that is perplexing. Such a situation has an existential quality, as our ideas, values, and habits are not sufficient to solve the problematic situation. It is a disruption of what we know. The only way to truly resolve the situation and grow as a person is to engage in the sympathetic understanding and inquiry into our assumptions. That is an empathetic process of active listening to the experiences of others and using imagination to gain access to those experiences. This requires an interaction that is, for the moment, judgment-free, because one must allow one's own values to be questioned as one examines and questions the experiences of those who are in the same situation. Addams speaks of an humbleness. This can be a discomforting process, but leads to insights and knowledge that are otherwise not attainable. It broadens our understanding of what it is to be human. Thus, for Addams, insensitivity to the suffering of others is mainly a lack of imagination and empathy. So in Democracy and Social Ethics, Addams described the case of how charity workers and the poor misunderstand each other. She does not doubt the honest motivation of a charity worker, but is quite critical of the practice of charity in itself. She describes a continuous lack of understanding and clash of values between helper and the helped. In her time, charity workers tended to be young middle-class women. So Adam genders the charity worker as such. Adam starts with the observation that the only families that apply for charitable aid are those that have come into financial troubles, or, as she puts it, have come to grief on the industrial side. Thus, the focus of charity workers on the financial troubles and the stretch of teaching and helping is laid upon the industrial virtues, to the detriment of acknowledging the other virtues the family might have. The charity worker runs into trouble because her middle-class morals do not really apply to the circumstances of the recipients of charity. For those recipients of help are used to emotional kindness with which help is given to them by their neighbors. Yet, here is a delay and guarded caution in the way care is given to them by the charity worker that they do not recognize from the care practices in their immediate surroundings. To quote Addams again, the most serious effect upon the poor comes when dependent upon charitable society is substituted for the natural outgoing of human love and sympathy. Happily, we all possess in some degree. Of this clash of values and realizing the power dynamics at play, Adam gives an interesting comparison of the role of clothing for the charity worker herself and the poor working woman. The charity worker is often surprised and disapproves that many working women spend a large amount of their income on clothes. But it is through her clothes that the working woman can find a measure of equality with the middle-class women and climb the social ladder. The working woman knows that she cannot succeed in the business environment or engage with the middle class on a somewhat equal ground without looking the part. On the other hand, the recipients of charity are just as much perplexed with the charity worker as they are with them, for they cannot understand her motives. For in their eyes, the charity worker is a successful woman, but success in their experience is not associated with charity and kindness. Kindness and charity do not make a rich landlord, for instance. And because the charity worker is not part of the community she wants to bring aid to, she does not share the same experience of these people. And because of the distance between experiences, she would never be free from perplexities. In response to this, the charity worker can hold on to her values. However, she would find less opportunity for effective action this way. Or the charity worker, as Adam puts it, finds the wider social activity and the contact with the larger experiences not only increases her sense of social obligation, but at the same time recasts her social ideas. And more importantly, she reaches the old-time virtue of humility by a social process, not in the old way as the man who sits by the side of the road and puts dust upon his head, calling himself a contrite sinner, but she gets the dust upon her head because she has stumbled and fallen in the road through her efforts to push forward the mass, to march with a fellow. She has socialized this virtue, her virtues, not only through a social aim, but by a social process. In effect, Adam proposes to replace the individual morality of the charity worker with social ethics. As Cromie puts it, Addams did not think problems were best understood when the psychological was separated from the social. She recognizes the social embeddedness of both the helper and help. She maintained that a less authoritarian and more relational perspective allows a better apprehension of meanings. Addams' capacity to use perplexity to explore the value of what others have said to her, despite the discomfort it may cause her, and to operate from the assumption that people with whom she has spoken were speaking of something of value and with meaning, was therapeutic, Cromie concludes. So when one realizes the experience of another, you gain not just insights into their needs, but form common goals. You come to care about the other. Thus, sympathetic understanding is a process that is fundamentally dependent on the other. It's a joint action and joint construction of a new experience of care. Sympathetic understanding not only provides knowledge for addressing the needs of others or collective problems, but it also immediately motivates. Addams speaks of this exchange of experiences and experimental adjustments of her beliefs and values as a democratic temperament. She sums up, "We are thus brought to a conception of democracy not merely as a sentiment which desires the well-being of all men, not yet as a creed which believes in the essential dignity and equality of all men, but as that which affords a rule of living as well as a test of faith. And here Addams introduces a radical notion of democracy. For Addams, democracy is not just a system of government, but democracy is a way of life, an expression of social ethics. Democracy is not defined as numerical majority rule, but the recognition of people's unique experiences as valuable sources of knowledge and a principled inclusion of everyone in decision making. This idea of democracy as a way of life is a notion John Dewey in fact took from Addams. Social morality results in a democratic temperament, if not always in its practice, because it recognizes that the diversity of human experiences should elicit sympathetic understanding, as Siegfried summons up Addams' work. It is not diversity as such that necessarily leads to democracy, but a particular way we deal with the diversity of experiences. In emphasizing the value of everyone's experiences, in particular the experience of the marginalized, Addams refers to sympathetic understanding, this the identification of the common lot. Or, as Addams formulates it, we know at last that we can only discover truth by a rational and democratic interest in life. And to give truth complete social expression is the endeavor upon which we are entering. Thus, the identification with the common lot, that is the essential D of democracy, becomes the source and expression of social ethics. It is though we thirsted at the great wells of human experience because we know that the dauntier or less potent draught not carry us to the end of the journey, going forward as we must in the heat and jostle of the crowd. The current social, political, and economic circumstances call for social ethics, a methodological application of an imaginative empathy that results in sympathetic knowledge and the establishment of a democratic way of living. Addams' notion of democracy is a fundamental critique of liberal notions of democracy as a process where individuals satisfy and protect their own needs by voting. For Addams and the pragmatists he influenced, democracy is therefore not just a political form, but democracy is also a form of association, a conjoint communicated experience. An association that's especially appropriate for us as persons who are constituted by multiple relations to evolve our consciousness and to develop our values. Democracy is therefore also an expression of faith in the possibility of progress for all, with empathy as its driving force. And also, to return to Hull House must be understood as an experimental realization of such a form of association, an experimental practice of sympathetic understanding. In sympathetic understanding, Addams brings together epistemology, ethics, and political theory. A political theory that, unlike most, does not depart from conflict, in that conflict does not need to precede sympathetic understanding, just a moment of perplexity. A politics that gives a necessary role to empathy. Instead of empathy leading us into biased ethics and understanding of the world, empathy becomes a necessary condition for gaining knowledge and understanding of the needs of others. Empathy, methodologically deployed for the gaining of sympathetic knowledge, becomes indispensable for the establishment and maintaining of democracy. Addams' notion of sympathetic understanding is relevant for us in that it raises questions on the need to teach empathy as a joint action, the need for a communal space to share experiences and form communities, the ability for universities to gain knowledge of certain social issues without actually being part of those communities, and also the question of how public administrators and politicians engage with the experiences of people. To sum up, Addams argues that our current social, political, and economical circumstances call for social ethics if we want to achieve societal progress. We need to realize that we stand in reciprocal social relationships with others. To express this sentiment, I would like to end with her words. This is the penalty of democracy, that we are bound to move forward or retrograde together. None of us can stand aside. Our feet are mired in the same soil, and our lungs breathe the same air. So, thank you for listening.